Maybe you remember last week's story. If not, I'll recap a little. Elijah was afraid, fleeing for his life. Elijah was tired, taking refuge in a cave in the wilderness by himself. Elijah was burnt out, asking that he might die. Elijah was done. And in the midst of Elijah's doneness, there is God, in the sound of sheer silence, who meets him where he is, in his fear, in his exhaustion, in his weariness, and who reminds Elijah he is not alone. God is with Elijah in that place, in his doneness. And indeed, God reminds him there are 7,000 more faithful Israelites who have not given in to worshiping false gods. Nor, God goes on to remind him that Elijah's job as a prophet is not done. He will anoint 2 new kings, and he will anoint his successor as prophets, which is where today's story picks up. If Elijah's story from last week teaches us that God is with us in our doneness, Elisha's story reminds us that the work continues and is not up to any of us alone. Elijah's story sets the scene for Elisha's story, which unfolds in 2 parts. First, introduced towards the end of last week's reading from 1 Kings 19, and then continuing with today's dramatic scene of fiery chariots and horses in 2 Kings. Personally, though, I'm more interested in the first part, the quieter story. In contrast to Elijah's brief and rather unremarkable call story, in which he just seems to appear out of nowhere, Elisha's own initial call, while still brief, offers us a bit more. On the heels of God's charge to Elijah last week, Elijah immediately and without much narrative commentary sets out from the cave where he had been hiding and finds Elisha, who is plowing with his 12 yoke of oxen, and throws his mantle over him as a sign of Elisha's soon-to-be succession as prophets. It's kind of a bizarre detail, but for Elisha's part, he recognizes something in this as an almost immediate recognition and acceptance of his call. Just as importantly, though, is what Elisha does in between. After Elijah's mantle falls on him, but before he sets out to follow his new mentor and teacher. Let me kiss my father and my mother, Elisha says, and then I will follow you. No harsh rebuttal from Jesus here. It's a different story, centuries later. But instead, a tender moment with his family, taking time to say goodbye and to thank them. Perhaps, as one commentary suggests, for the fertile spiritual ground they have cultivated in him. More than a mere succession story between prophets, from one prophet to another, Elisha's story places this prophet squarely within the context of the community who formed him. A community as integral to God's mission as the one who is being sent. In the midst of a life-changing call, Elisha doesn't abandon the community who shaped him, even though he leaves, but he takes time to honor their place in the mission we share, as the baptismal liturgy puts it. The mission shared of bearing God's creative, redeeming, and justice-seeking word to all the world. Quite simply, there would be no Elisha without the community who formed him. And Elisha pauses, if only for a moment, to acknowledge that and to remind us there is room for everyone in this work of love and justice, not only for those who are sent and go, but also for those who have formed them, for those who will come after, and for those who have come before. This week, as Pride Month comes to a close, I've been thinking a bit about those who have come before. 56 years and 1 day ago, in the early morning hours of June 28th, it was also a Saturday that year, the NYPD raided the Stonewall Inn. It wasn't the first time the police would raid a gay bar, but it was the first time the patrons fought back, resulting in a 5-day gathering of resistance and protest among community members. The protest at Stonewall would quickly inspire activism around the country, and by the next year would also result in the first gay pride parades in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago. Were it not for the early protesters at Stonewall, pride as we know it, 56 years and 1 day later, would not exist. Closer to home, I remember the stories of Ruth Frost, Phyllis Zilhart, and Jeff Johnson. Does anybody know those names? Ruth, Phyllis, and Jeff were ordained as pastors extraordinarily in 1990, outside of the bounds of official ELCA teaching and practice, when the ELCA didn't yet permit the ordination of openly gay and lesbian clergy. Ruth, Phyllis, and Jeff's ordinations would go on to spark a movement so much bigger than themselves, a movement that ultimately became what is now Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, today accompanying openly LGBTQIA+ candidates for ministry through an often tumultuous ordination process, myself included. Jeff Johnson, by the way, is now bishop in the Sierra Pacific Synod. How times have changed. Elisha's story reminds us of the importance of those who have come before us, the communities who have formed us, and the communities who have paved the way ahead of us. Elisha's story also reminds us that the work we have is not ours to do alone. It might not even be completed in our lifetime. This past week, as many celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Supreme Court ruling that made marriage equality the law of the land, we have seen more recent Supreme Court decisions banning gender-affirming care for transgender youth and allowing parents to have their kids removed from classes simply because they read books with LGBTQ characters in them. It can feel like the progress we've made is being stalled or even pulled back. It can feel deflating and discouraging. And even while we have to acknowledge that the movement and progress itself ebbs and flows and has its victories as well as its setbacks, we also know the work to be done, the work of the gospel, the work of love and justice, of bearing God's creative, redeeming, and justice-seeking word to all the world is not done. The work continues, from Elijah to Elisha, from Jesus to his disciples, from our ancestors in faith to those of us here today. Of one thing I am certain: we have the opportunity to be for others what those who came before us have been for us, and we will be for others what those who came before us have been for us. Each of us picking up the mantle of our ancestors in faith to ultimately hand it on to the next generation, entrusting our church and our world to God who is faithful, who continues to raise up faithful witnesses and prophets in every time and place.